Once your UVs are projected, it's now a question of getting them properly laid out within the 0 to 1 space. Now, there are a couple different ways that you can do this depending on your intended next steps. If you're planning to paint this by hand in Photoshop, you can kind of get away with stacking identical objects and their UVs in your UV space. And to do that, you want to avoid duplicating these until after you got things laid out. So I can actually start my UV layout right now with just the one wheel. I'll go down here to arrange and layout. And there's just a button here that says layout, and that throws everything in here. Now there's a bit of an issue with the default settings for that, and that is this. There's always a bit of blurring once you bring this into Maya, which causes a little bit of the outside to get blended into the inside of the shells when you paint them. Because of that, you always want to have a bit of, well, it's called bleed in the printing industry. You want to have some of the pixels outside so that when it blurs the edges, the outside pixels that get pulled in look the same as the ones on the inside. And because these are touching, you can't have any of that bleed on the outside of this. Not only that, but if there's anything on the left side that's touching the image right here, it'll bleed from the other side because this uses Pac-Man rules. Any pixels on the right side line up the pixels on the left side, and the top and bottom as well, which means that this will bleed into this and vice versa. Even if there's nothing over here, if you just have an empty space, that will bleed over into anything that's touching the edge right here. So we need to have a certain amount of space between these. So instead of using the default layout settings, I'm going to go up here to Modify, Layout Option Box. And there's a couple things I want to change down here. First of all, texture map size. I want this to be the maximum that my computer will allow, 4096. That's called a 4K map. And then shell padding. I like to give my shell padding a minimum of 16 pixels at the 4K size. Tile padding is the padding between the shells and the edge of the tiles. Because that gap is going to be spread out over both sides of the tile edge, I can have half on each side and have 8 on one side plus 8 on the other side equals 16, so it's the same as the shell padding. Now if I hit apply, it spreads things out and gives you a little bit of empty space to guarantee that nothing gets bled over onto the other shells. Now that we've got the extra space between all the objects, I can worry about duplicating these wheels. So I can Control D and move this one back here. Get that in the right position. I'll select both of these. I'm going to duplicate them again, but instead of moving them, I'm going to put them in a group with Control G. And that group is centered in the center of my scene, which means if I throw a -1 to scale X, it'll flip them over to the other side. I don't want to leave them that group, so I'm going to reselect them, and Shift P will remove them from the group. And then I can select all my new objects. I'll actually just make sure I select everything. Modify freeze transformations to get rid of any negatives in my scale. And now you can see all the tire parts are stacked up instead of having multiple versions of them. If I look at right here, shaded view, you can actually see the different tires stacked up right here. It looks a little bit different than this one because there are 4 wheels sitting right here on top of each other. Now that is fine if you're painting in Photoshop by hand, but if you're trying to paint this in something like Substance 3D Painter, that's going to be a bit of an issue. You see, the way Substance 3D Painter works is it creates maps. And those maps help it control how it creates procedural textures. And those maps are things like ambient occlusion, where it creates a black and white image that tells it how close these faces are to these faces up here. But the problem is, this wheel and this wheel are currently using the same UV space. So it's going to pick one of these wheels to generate the ambient occlusion. And because they're surrounded by slightly different geometry, they're not going to match up with the other wheel's position over here. Also, that has maps like the position map, which is going to say that this tire is going to be painted in such a way that it says this is close to the front in the z-axis, which is going to be blue. And on the left side, which is the x-axis, we're just going to make it red. And it's going to use the exact same pixels on all of these, regardless of where they're positioned along the model. So the procedural texture generation will not work with these stacked UV shells. So instead of doing the layout first and then duplicating, if you plan on working in Substance Painter, you want to do the duplication first and then layout to keep the wheels separate. Other things you might want to keep in mind is that the procedural texturing works better if these are laid out in straight lines. So all of these angled tires right here, they're not going to work as well. It's going to make issues for some of the patterns it may throw on here. So for things like this, I like to orient my shells. It gives me nice straight shells right here. I can select anything in here. Like these are my windows. Orient those. And I can then rotate them by hand. Make sure they match up with the correct orientation. Those are all the insides of the tires right here. Orient those as well. Once I've done that, I can lay out again. And now things are a bit more organized and coordinated. You also don't have to leave this using the default layout. You can change the scale of some of these objects. Like, for instance, I don't tend to view the underside of the car as particularly important. I may scale that down. And let me then move things around and group them up. So I can find them easier if I need to. But once again, we're painting this in Substance Painter, and that's less of an issue now. There is a bit of a gap up here, but that's because it's just doing its best to keep everything grouped together. But like I said, you can always adjust these yourself. But for Substance Painter, I usually don't bother. And that is how we lay out our UVs.